Friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about the 2025 testing. Lewis Hamilton is in red. When it comes to the form book, it's very difficult to tell what that exactly looks like right now. And if we're being honest with ourselves, the very unseasonable weather in Bahrain may have masked everything. As you'll hear, Dick and I seek to determine what exactly we can take away from this year's testing days in Bahrain. I'll give you a tip. I can't contain my excitement for Australia. Apologies in advance. But before we get to our conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Dick, it is the 2025 Formula One season.
You know, it felt like a long off season, and yet it didn't feel like a long off season. And it seems like we were just wrapping everything up in Abu Dhabi, and here we are. We're now 2 weeks away from the first Grand Prix of the year. Very excited.
Me too. Well, our audience doesn't know, our friends don't know that we've actually been hard at work during the break ourselves. And so that's why it doesn't feel like we've had much of a break. They
Because we
didn't
haven't.
because we really haven't. We've been working our day jobs and trying to get stuff done with the podcast because we have a lot of content that we're going to be sending out over these next weeks. But we wanted to get together and talk about testing because I think this year more than any, I'm fascinated to have this conversation, maybe because, or I don't want to say fascinated. I'm excited to have this conversation because I feel like a lot of the tech stuff that you have discussed in our previous conversations have helped me to see more than I
Hmm.
ever did in the past. And because of where we are in the reg cycle, the value of testing could be kind of overlooked.
Sure.
And so I think that we getting to talk together about this and unpack it will be fun and worth, I think, the time that our listeners would have of just looking at it from different dimensions. So let's get started. What do you think? Ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So what did we see? I think I've heard some people say that the 2025 season could be considered a throwaway season considering the regulations are changing in 26. I would ask you, do you agree with that and why or why not?
I think it depends on what team that you're at. If I'm at stake, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to finish ninth or 10th in the Constructors' Championship. So might as well just start focusing on 26, right? Because that's when they become formally the Audi team, et cetera, et cetera. So they're probably more interested in building out processes and learning how to quickly and efficiently design new components that actually work on a car, as opposed to worrying about where they finish in the Constructors' Championship. However, if you're a McLaren, Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, you still have a lot at stake because winning the Constructors' Championship is worth millions and millions of dollars, right? Not only in prize money at the end of the season, but also, and just think about like merchandise sales and all those other kinds of things. And, let's face it, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. So, if Mercedes wins a race on Sunday, does that present an uptick in sales for them? In the weeks that follow, probably does if they're road cars, right? And so, Ferrari's in the same boat. So I think it's fair to say that, yeah, this championship isn't necessarily a throwaway because they're going to have to stay ahead of the opposition if they want to win the championship. But they've got to balance that with their designing for the 2026 car, which is completely different. I think the really sticky one is, what do you do if you're Aston Martin, Alpine, Williams, Haas,
Sauber?
Sauber? Well, Sauber, yeah, I think they're totally on 2026. I think those other teams, though, that are more what we would consider the midfield teams, I think that they're going to probably be in the situation where if they're just getting annihilated from the word go, they may make a decision very early in the season to say, you know what, we're focused on 2026. Yeah, we might bring a few development bits, but we're just not going to do this very much. But I think the top four teams, I think that they're going to be walking a very, very fine line between do enough on the existing cars for this year to keep them in the game for the Constructors' Championship in 25 without hurting their prospects for 2026. I think it's going to be very fascinating to see who clearly bails early on the development of the 2025 car and starts focusing entirely on 26. That's my take.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. If anything, as I was watching testing, I kept thinking testing really needs to be the scenario where they're testing out hypotheticals for 25 that can guide them for the 25 season, but even more for the 26. Like the things that you
Right.
know are going to either be in place for 26 that will be carryover, the things that you've learned over this reg cycle about things like ground effects and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Where are the tweaks that you're going to want to make in
Hmm.
this in early process, especially with this whole, and we can get to this later, but the whole change that'll happen in Barcelona with the flexi wings. Like I felt like that's going to be another major
Major.
develop major,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Okay, good. So
Major.
I was going to ask you that because in my assessment, I thought it's like it seems like you would want to maximize under this quote reg and see that as almost like a 2.1 of the year,
Hmm.
like slight change but enough to make a difference. And you
Yep.
would have to really be thinking what were the lessons from last year that we could do the incremental changes over winter break, and or if we have new tools in our disposal, I'm thinking like Aston Martin, where can you then take advantage of this short window before Barcelona, and then once Barcelona hits, it's really a short window before you're like, okay, we how much more are we going to sink into this 25 year and just
Right.
stem the losses, and
Right.
or how much can we fight for? Okay,
Yep.
so that's good. I'm glad to hear that we have agreement, and also that my not as veteran status is actually not detracting from my ability to see different layers in this. But I think one of the things I would love for us to kind of lay as a baseline, especially for any of our listeners who might be new to Formula One, is what exactly are they testing? Like, I think that that may be a misunderstanding in some people's minds. So let's just make sure it's very clear before we go into any analysis. So, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, so they are certainly testing cars that are now highly evolved from what we saw when the first, when these sets of regs came into being. And so if you're a McLaren, if you're a Red Bull, hey man, you're looking at incremental gains. You're not going to be seeing huge, huge steps. On the other hand, let's take a Williams or an Aston Martin. Those are two teams that are actually going back, and really let's throw Alpine in the middle of that. They're actually going in and evolving how they actually produce a race car. And so if you think about it, Williams has gone from producing a car using a massive Excel spreadsheet to actually using modern, manufacturing processes. And
I
and it
know
showed.
you weren't being snarky about that. You were being like very fair and kind to them in that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Mad respect for what James Vowles is doing. He's transforming that team. It's just amazing to watch what they're doing. And so they have a car that was produced on time. It came in right on the minimum weight. Same for Alpine. They've gotten past all of the reorgs and the chaos at the very top of the organization, and they've got what appears to be some stability there. Well, guess what? They show up, they've got a car that's ready to go, and it's right on the minimum weight limit. That you could not say that about Williams and Alpine last year. The
That's
Williams
right.
was like really heavy.
That's
And
right.
and then you have Aston Martin that's got finally their own brand new factory. They've got a wind tunnel that's starting to come online. They've hired hundreds and hundreds of people, as has Williams. Williams has gone from, I think, 700 people to just over 1,000 with more to hire. And then you think about in the case of Aston Martin, apparently that car is 95% new compared to the car they ran in 2024. So, I mean, that's unbelievable, right? Given that it's the last year of this particular formula. Those guys, they're clearly trying to learn how to produce and improve the cars that they have. So yeah, pretty impressive. So it may not be as obvious, but they're certainly out there testing and learning stuff that may just be infrastructure, you know?
That's really good point. And I would even ask you to clarify, and that has really nothing to do with Adrian Newey. That was
Right.
what they were already on track to do
Right.
of they wanted to come in with the new car. And
Yeah.
considering where they were or where they have been the last 2 years, you can see with the new infrastructure or the full infrastructure that they've been projecting for why they would go that fullest length at this point. In my opinion, you can see it in 25. Like you got to get it right,
Hmm.
like of understanding your infrastructure
Right.
now before the regs change. So
Right.
therefore, you're better equipped to design and do everything in 26. So
Yep.
yeah, the value of testing cannot be underestimated. So let's then answer the question, I guess, of, or no, maybe it's not a question people have, but I think it's a valuable thing to consider, which is the evolution of testing.
Hmm.
You and John have been very fundamental to me understanding that in previous years, testing did not look like what we see today.
Correct.
And we have drivers who really came into their own in Formula One during those previous eras of unrestricted testing. How do you think that compares to the newer young quote younger drivers that they are having to learn their craft and or develop their comfort inside of a Formula One car, inside of a more restricted testing environment, and even that now rely on sim racing? How do you think that's affecting what we see in testing?
I think that for guys like Alonso and Hamilton, it has to be a massive advantage because those guys were literally, especially Alonso when he was driving as a test driver for Renault and there was no limits on how much he tested. He was out there pounding out thousands of miles worth of laps. Hamilton, not as much because he came in a few years later, but still, he got a lot of mileage. And that seat time is super valuable. Now, I know that as the simulators become more and more realistic, that really helps a lot for the younger drivers. And so they're not on track, but they're driving these, ginormously expensive simulators a lot, and that's helping them. But I think there's things around track evolution or does the track devolve after a rainstorm or whatever. Alonso and Hamilton just have more of that because they just got more miles under them. And so they're able to get up to speed a whole lot quicker. And I think, even though a wind tunnel may say the car's going to do this, until you get on the track, you really don't know if it is or not. And Alonso or a Hamilton, because they know what to kind of expect because of all the mileage they've got, they can come in and say, yep, the car is right where it needs to be, or hey, we've got some real weaknesses here, here, and here. I just think they've got a huge advantage. Nico Hulkenberg, you might throw him in that category as well because of the endurance racing that he did. He's just got so many thousands of miles just because of the nature of the racing that he did when he was driving in the endurance racing. So I think there's some benefit there too.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that because I thought about adding Nico and then I went back and forth in that list. But I think it's such a valid point. And as you were talking, I remembered, so during winter break, I've been trying to read the new Mercedes book, the one called Inside Mercedes F1.
Mm.
And I got to the chapter where they're talking about the work that Mick Schumacher did in the sim.
Yep.
It's very fascinating to understand. Like this author got such unprecedented access. And this isn't technically a plug. I mean, we would be happy to plug the book and, help Mercedes out. But I just literally just read it because I'm always wanting to learn. And they were highlighting that the sim is almost as good as real life, but there's still disadvantages. One of them being like the speed, or I have to go back and look at it. But essentially, there was this one key element that they said we cannot truly compare to reality and have to be
Mm.
mindful of the impact on the driver, the sim racer, because of the equilibrium element of it. And it was been a few weeks since I read this, so that's why I'm not doing a very good job. If I had intended to talk about this, I would have gotten the quote. As I read it, I kept thinking sim has its value, but it cannot ever truly supersede or undo what is that seat time, as you said, and
Yeah,
that we have to find a balance in the sport of giving both to the racer so that way they can truly extract all it out of the car as possible and develop their racecraft. So, I
right.
mean, I'm a big fan of sim racing, and I think it has a very important component to developing a
Sure,
racer. So yeah,
sure.
that's why I think that was probably what led me to ask this question of just contemplating Alonso and Hamilton, and as you said, Nico, of what they have that advantage, I think, against all the others,
Yeah.
which when we talk about like their age can be seen as a detriment, and the younger kids have it. So it kind of balances out maybe in some ways the experience versus not having experience.
Yep.
Okay. So and then another thing as I was observing testing, I kept thinking about track evolution, that
Yep.
testing is 8 hours over 3 days. And that the question I kept having in my mind is how does that really compare with 1 to 2 hours of a Grand Prix after 2 days of free practice and or a sprint race? What does that mean for the track? And what information does the team actually get during testing? And then how do they extrapolate that data? Because it's not apples to apples. And so how do they extrapolate the data from 8 hours every day for 3 days to help them forecast for a Grand Prix weekend? What do you think?
It's a great question. And if you assume no rain, the track on the third day ought to be at its very fastest, assuming the weather conditions are roughly the same and all that. And if you haven't had rain, the track is going to be slow on the first day because it's going to be dirty and not much rubber laid down. But by the third day, man, the track should be clean and there should be a ton of rubber laid down. So it ought to be very, very grippy. This year, maybe not the case because it actually rained in the desert. And so that track was washed off and they kind of started all over again, which I think is going to cause the engineers a lot of pause. I think they're going to be spending a lot of time in their laptops trying to get to the bottom of just how much did the track evolve and then how much did it devolve after the rain and did it pick back up? So I think it's a really interesting question. The other thing to remember about a Grand Prix weekend, typically it's not just the Grand Prix cars that are laying rubber down on the track over a 3-day weekend. You've also got F2 and F3 probably out there running, and maybe some Porsche Cup or Ferrari Challenge, whatever. So there's cars on the track all the time laying rubber down. So the track is evolving. It's just not the F1 cars are doing it to the track. It's a whole bunch of different cars. So that actually, if the rubber is somewhat compatible, that means that it's sort of like they've been watching a track have 3 days of, I don't know, 6 to 8 hours of running on them for 3 days in a row because of all the other classes that are running on a normal race weekend, if that
Yeah,
makes
that's
sense.
a good, yes, it does. And that's a really great point because I did overlook the feeders and other type of activities that would be happening on the track. Okay, that helps me a lot. And I do agree the rain in the desert and then also it was cooler conditions. I mean,
Much cooler.
yeah, right? It seemed like higher management wasn't as much of an issue as I expected it to be. And I think it probably allowed the drivers to push their cars quite more to the limit. Yes?
For sure. And
Okay.
that's one thing, and we'll talk about it when we talk about Mercedes here, but just think about this. Mercedes always worked well in cooler conditions, right?
Yeah.
Last year.
Yeah,
Think
they
of it,
did.
think Las Vegas, right? Another
Hmm.
desert, and it was cold. So now we're in the desert. It's colder than normal. The ambient was usually around 15 degrees centigrade, which would be 60 degrees, I think, something like that. That's quite a bit cooler than most Grand Prix are run. Yet Mercedes wasn't just light years ahead of everybody. Now, I'm not sure what that means necessarily because it's not a race weekend, it's a practice and it's testing. And who knows what fuel loads are being run and all that other kind of stuff that we'll talk about. But it sure is interesting that it really didn't look like Mercedes had an advantage in the cold weather when last year they certainly seemed to have that advantage. So, something to think about.
I think that's so true and so helpful because it especially considering where we know Mercedes wants to be. They
Right.
need to make sure that they're not operating with incorrect paradigm. Like again, reading from the book, there were so many different areas where they were wrestling with that over the course of the season that this book is
Right.
written about. And that they were constantly like kind of scratching their heads and going, but why is this happening? And then they would make the adjustments and still trying to pull from the data. So, yeah. Okay. So you mentioned fuel load. So, fuel
Yep.
load is also different in the testing environment than it is in a Grand Prix weekend. So, do you think that that also will affect how the data is extrapolated for the development race? Kind of like it's basically the same question in some ways to the track evolution and tire management, but fuel
Right.
load.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I know so because, obviously if you're running, the more fuel you run, the heavier the car is, the slower the car is going to go, right? It also, though, does give you some great ideas about, what your potential race pace is and all that.
Really? It does?
For race pace?
Yeah. When so
Certainly.
like okay, how so?
Well, what I'm saying is that when you run a car heavy, if you run a whole bunch of laps, the car is burning fuel. So every lap it's getting lighter and lighter, and they
Mm-hmm.
can see how the car is changing as it gets lighter.
Mm,
And so
mm,
they can plan, regardless of where they started from, because those guys know exactly how much fuel is in the car. And when they come in, they'll literally pump the fuel out of the tank, see how much is left, and then say, okay, we burned X number of liters of fuel and we did X number of laps. This is what our fuel load looks like. And of course, they'll see that to a certain degree just on the data coming off of the movement of the suspension and where the dynamic ride height is and all those kinds of things. Because as the car gets lighter, it's going to be riding a little bit higher in the air, right? The ground clearance is going to go up.
right. Okay, that helps a little bit because I guess I was wondering, it's testing. You have all these hours. Why wouldn't they run a fuel load that's equivalent to a Grand Prix weekend when you're sending the car out? Or why wouldn't you just put enough for a quali lap, so you can kind of
Right,
see it? Why are they
right.
putting out that full? But you're saying it's actually beneficial for them to go to the full fuel load that they do, because then that gives them more opportunities to discern a
Yeah,
lot more data.
how the car is going to operate over
Mm-hmm.
over a full stint, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, there were guys out there, they were doing race distances,
Right.
you know. So, so
Okay.
they started with a full load of fuel.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. Very good. Very helpful. Okay. So turn down engine. You mentioned this to me over our before we started recording. So can
Yep.
you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's different modes that these engines come with, right? And it's always like, when Lewis Hamilton was just dominating F1 with Mercedes, he'd go out as an example in Q2 and he'd set a good time. And then they'd go into Q3 and all of a sudden he goes half a second faster. Well, it turns out that what was happening is that the Mercedes engineers for Q3 were dialing the engine up um, to produce more horsepower. And it would have to do with, the spark advance on the ignition timing and, what the fuel injectors were doing and all that kind of jazz. But anyway, they'd produce a whole bunch more power and they'd go out and they'd set these fastest laps. Well, it can go the other way too, and you can take power away. And so you may have guys that are not really turning lap times that are very spectacular because they're slow down the straightaways, and yet they're quite quick in the corners. And so there's a little bit of masking just what their potential really is. And I suspect, based on what I've read, there's at least one team that was doing that during the practice, during this test. So we'll know for sure in 2 weeks' time.
That's right, we will. So then you also mentioned that there was a lot of commentary regarding Flovis. Why did that perk your ears and we should be paying attention to it?
Yeah, so Flovis, for those of you who don't know what that is, that's usually, I mean, it comes in all sorts of different colors, but primarily you see it in this kind of greenish yellow color. Think of it as like an ink. It's not really paint, but it's more like an ink. And they'll apply it to various surfaces on the car, and then the car will go out and drive around the track, and then they'll come back in and they'll look at how the wind has moved this ink around the car. And they can then see, is the air behaving like their wind tunnel says that it's behaving, or their CFD, computational fluid dynamics. All of that goes in to say, hey, it either correlates visibly with what we saw in the wind tunnel or CFD, or it doesn't. What's really interesting to me is like McLaren used a lot of it, apparently. In fact, there's a picture of them. They realized, oops, we put so much on the car. Anybody with a good camera can see exactly what our aerodynamics are doing. And so when they rolled in to the pits, they immediately had all their mechanics swarm around the car and they rolled the car in the garage. And the reason for swarming the car with the mechanics, I mean, they were literally lined up shoulder to shoulder so that nobody could take a picture of their car standing still because they were suddenly realized, uh-oh, somebody could look at this and know exactly what we're doing with our aero, which is fascinating if you think about it. But I mean, they can still get pictures while they're out on track. And so what that says to me is they may not have full confidence in their wind tunnel.
Oh, that's huge.
Either that or they're saying, man, we better make sure that wind tunnel's working right.
As in, like, it's so good, it scares us, you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. I did see the whole human wall of mechanics. And I
Hmm.
think like even the commentators made a joke about it. And you could see a photographer was trying to get his camera over their heads. It was kind of comical.
Yep.
But oh, it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, it's a real big deal. And all the teams were running it. It's really interesting
Right.
because they've obviously been using the aero rakes now for a long time, and they were certainly in evidence everywhere, right? But FlowViz, I mean, this has been around for 100 years, the concept of it anyway. And so all of a sudden, they're back using it like extensively. I mean, they always have used it to a degree, but I mean, this time it was like they were kind of everybody was kind of using it a lot. So I thought that was interesting.
That is. I'm gonna have to be thinking about that between now and Australia because it'll be so fascinating to see how that really does inform their decisions for the starting position of the first practice.
Hmm.
Okay. So then let's move on to actually some of our individual takeaways regarding the teams. And you wisely said, let's do matchups between teams so we can get through them, one, but two, because we kind of see them in similar or interesting ways, I think.
Yep.
So the first two was Red Bull and McLaren. What are your thoughts about them?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, most of the pundits think that McLaren is probably a little bit better. But what's interesting is that the Red Bull, Red Bull has come out and said that their car in 2024 really was very hard to come to grips with, that it was very inconsistent, which kind of makes you wonder about the whole thing with Checo. I mean, it does give us a little bit more insight into why Red Bull moved so slowly to replace Checo. And so this year's car is built around the idea of let's make the car more consistent in its handling. In other words, not quite so tricky to get into the setup window and then stay there. So it's a bit more forgiving of a car, which Max will use to very good effect. And let's face it, Red Bull wasn't seriously impressive in the first 2 days of practice. And then they came out with a development package. I mean, think about this. They brought a development package for the last day of preseason testing. I mean, that kind of tells you what their mindset is. These guys are not taking this season lightly. And I think getting beaten by McLaren last year for the Constructors' Championship did not set well with them. And so they clearly saw something at home that they didn't like, and they started building development parts before the cars ever left for Bahrain and testing. And the parts were available. They threw them on the car for Friday, and suddenly Max is right there. And so I think Red Bull's going to be a force. But let's see, they had some reliability problems. They had water pressure issues when Liam Lawson was driving the car, and they lost quite a bit of time there. So we'll see. But I think kind of I'm going to call these the grouping as 1A. I'm kind of calling it Red Bull and McLaren right now. Could be completely wrong, but that's kind of the way I'm going to call what I'll call Group 1A. And then we got Group 1B.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think they being Red Bull was really trying to create a reliable platform
Yep.
for both Max and Liam, but especially for Max. And I agree with you, being not getting the constructors had to have put a fire under all of them.
Oh
And
yeah.
I think it was actually this the episode we just released with Joe Sayward, and Joe highlighted in his interview that by not winning the constructors, how many of the team members' bonuses, which many of them rely upon financially,
Yeah.
how hard that hit them, like literally in their pocketbooks. And that could be
Right.
implications for team members, financial, like being able to buy a car, whatever it is. It's not like
Yep.
when I guess I'd always thought of a bonus kind of like what we think of in the corporate world of a bonus, but I got the sense from him and the interview that it's much more significant to the team members because of all the sacrifice in the way the teams operate. So I would imagine that everybody is like, hey, we can't have this happen 2 years in a row. So it
Right.
makes sense why they would be doing everything to make sure that this was not a repeat of 24.
Yeah. Mama needs a new car.
Exactly. Okay. So that, and then I do think McLaren will be interesting to see. They've got a taste of success. Now they've unlocked it. Are they going to want to keep going and are they going to be able to keep going? And then you add in the driver dynamic. So far, we've only talked about the team. We haven't even talked about drivers, and I don't think we will today because it's more about testing. I
Right.
could imagine that the team is like, okay, we got to make sure that this is the best that it can be. So that way they can really let their two stallions go for it,
Yep.
run out of the gate. Okay,
Yep.
so the next duo, Mercedes and Ferrari. What are your thoughts about the impact on Hamilton to adjust to a Ferrari power unit after always being in a Mercedes power unit? Do you have any thoughts about that?
That's a great question. It all depends on the characteristics of those engines. Drivability is such a big deal. And I've never really heard whether somebody would think that the Ferrari was a more drivable engine than a Mercedes engine, right? So I think he'll have spent so much time, obviously, in the simulator and then, using the testing in an old car. Certainly, he had sampled Ferrari power by that time and knew what was on tap for him, I guess, and what to expect. And of course, a guy like Hamilton, he's super adaptable anyway. So it probably was a bigger adjustment for him, just the Ferrari culture versus the Mercedes culture versus figuring out the engine. I would
Hmm.
imagine he probably came to grips to that faster than he did with the culture and navigating team politics and all those kinds of things.
I think that's a great insight. I know that, like, because I guess I thought that thinking like the technical side, but you're right. Like, the culture would have probably been the more long-term thing that he needs to unlock
Hmm.
versus the technical element of, because I mean, I guess, as you said, if there is no notable difference, it's not an issue. But
Right.
if there is a notable difference, it is an issue though, right? Like,
Right.
okay, so it wasn't odd to ask the question.
No,
It's
no.
just okay. Okay, that's good to know because it just was I just kept thinking about his career and where he's hopped around, not hopped around. He's gone through his maturation, and this seems like such a like crossing of the Rubicon. Huh,
Right.
actually, like going to Italy. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm making jokes. Okay, but going over is really changing so much. But you're right, it's probably the culture. Okay,
Yep.
that's good. And I know that before we started, you had even noted that we finally got to see Lewis and Rudd.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see how all that sorts out.
Yeah. Did you note any differences that, like, just his demeanor or anything like that, that you wanted to discuss now?
No, I don't think so. I think it's still early days, and he and Charles are trying to figure out how to communicate with each other. It's sort of like, let's work together to get the best car we can possibly get, and
Mm-hmm.
then we'll race each other once we get that taken care of.
Yeah.
One of
Did you
those
by
deals.
chance watch the F-175? Did you
Did
get to
not.
watch that? Okay, I
Did
watched
not.
it. And I don't know if you know, they were sitting beside each other at the table playing chess
Nice.
on their phones. I thought, well, that's good. As long as they keep working together and then the rivalry can come out in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Okay. So then our next one, Aston Martin and Alpine. What are your thoughts?
Well, interestingly enough, Alpine showed pretty well, and I think Gasly clearly was driving well. I think, Jack Doohan, his teammate, I think he did a pretty fair job. I think his whole deal really was is that, just, learn. He's got one Grand Prix start, and Gasly is a race winner. So, I think Alpine was a bit of a pleasant surprise. And there were several people saying, hey, under the right circumstances, don't be surprised if Alpine were to win a race. So I thought that was really an interesting comment. Aston Martin, on the other hand, kind of interesting. You read most of the pundits and they've said, well, Aston once again has, laid an egg here. They're not going to be very good this year. But I did read a couple of different articles that said that the writer was saying that Aston Martin was actually every bit as fast in whatever kind of corner you want as Red Bull and McLaren, but they had turned their engine way down so that they wouldn't show their pace. I don't know. As a Fernando fan, I hope that's true. But apparently, the GPS traces are saying that they're very, very quick in the corners. So I don't know. But like I said, they may be the number one sandbaggers out there.
Okay. I'm laughing because I think that's so great. I mean, it feels like the Wily Fox would do something like that.
Oh, yeah.
It seems
Oh, yeah.
appropriate. So
Yeah.
I'm excited at the possibility of them being, quote, sleepers under the
Yeah.
radar to everybody, being discounted after so many years and all the naysayers. And then,
Yep.
oh, hello, here we are. That'd be
Here
so
we are.
great.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, that'd
Because,
be so nice.
I never saw anything where Fernando was down or critical of the car, which says to me that he knows something that everybody else doesn't.
I love it. That'd be so
Yep.
much fun. 2 weeks
Oh, yeah.
can't come fast enough.
Yeah.
Okay, Williams and Haas.
So again, okay. So let's start with the obvious. I mean, Carlos Sainz was fastest on day two. You got to love it. I mean, you just have to love it. I mean, clearly, Williams, the work that they put in 2024, that paid off. Carlos coming, bringing the knowledge that he has of Ferrari and what that car feels like versus the Williams is clearly paid off. Williams is another one of those cars where they're not going to win, probably, but the odd podium, I think it's possible. Having said that, you think about like Haas. Haas, they had a very, very quiet test. It was like they didn't care that anybody else was there. They didn't care that anybody was looking at them or not looking at them. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. They had a program, they worked through it, and no fuss, no bother. They just got on with it. And they might surprise everybody, especially early in the year. Can Haas keep up the development pace with the top teams? No, I don't think so. And at some stage, they're going to have to start devoting their resources to 2026. But they may be a sleeper. They may be a sleeper. I think Aston, Alpine, Williams, and Haas, potentially all of them are sleepers.
When you say sleeper, as in to move up in the constructors or in winning a race?
How about getting to the top of the midfield
Hmm.
and narrowing the gap to the top four teams?
Okay. Okay, I
Yep.
can get behind that. I
Yep.
think that all four of those, as you noted, I could see them somehow, as what you've taught me, track specific
Yep.
win, right? I think that that could
Yep.
happen in any of these four. And
Yep.
I think they probably, in my mind, they're probably testing out the configurations or development things that they need to do to get to that win. Because
Yep.
all four of these teams are super smart about knowing where they can possibly grab points and how they can go against their competitors. And I think it's the midfield battle. So they're like, hey, let's see if we can not only get ahead of everybody, but could we somehow pull out that unpredicted by everybody, prevailing opinion that we could actually win this? I
Yep.
do agree with you that Haas, I think, was on their own thing and they were like, we don't really care what anybody thinks. We don't really care what anybody's doing. We're going to just do what we need to do. I listened to Ruth Buscom Divey, who is a commentator for F1, and she, as well as Bernie Collins during testing, they did some together and some separately. I was the crazy person who watched all of testing. Okay, we all know this is I'm that person. But I love listening to their commentary because they highlighted how some of these teams, how they think strategically about what they're doing. And
Yeah.
Ruth noted, I think it was Haas, that they're the group that just does not really feel the need to look around them. They've got their agenda. they need to they know what they want to do, and it just feels in line with what we know or what we've seen of Ayo Komatsu, that he's
Yep.
just not that type of person to worry about. He's like, I know what we got to do. I know what I need to lead my team, and we're just going to get it done. And then with Williams, like you said, James Vowles, I think has already shown us his leadership, and it makes sense that we would see such a major organizational advancement. But I have to
Hmm.
tell you, and then of course with Carlos being there, and as I said during our end of year analysis, like I'm kind of now a Carlos fangirl, but I'm also a little scared to hope that this is the turnaround we've been waiting for with Williams. If I put my eggs in that basket, are they going to drop the basket and then my eggs are crushed? I don't know. Do you think I'm being unrealistic in that, like, what's the word? It's not fear as much as desire to not get too hopeful.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But, like I said, with a car that suits a specific track and maybe some crazy circumstances being thrown on the field by the racing gods, so to speak, you might see a Williams driver on the podium, maybe, or a top
Yeah,
five, something like that. I
that'd
mean,
be
a top
so
five for them would be
wonderful.
a win.
It really would. I mean, I don't, as much as I said I'm a Carlos fan girl, I would be happy for Alex. Both of them, the team, like it would just feel so good. Talk about a
Hmm.
drive to survive moment.
Oh
It
my
would
gosh,
have to
yes.
be something they would have to talk about. And same
Yep.
thing with Haas. Like if either of those teams somehow pulled it out, I know I will be crying and jumping up and down if they
Yep.
got on a podium. So,
Yep.
okay. All right. Well, we're in agreement in many ways on that. All right. Last duo, Racing Bulls, no longer V-Carb, and Steak Sauber. What are your thoughts about them?
Yeah, well, they were definitely the two at the bottom of the totem pole, and kind of scratching my head about RB because last year they looked pretty good, but this year not so good. So I don't know. I mean, it's like kind of what happened, but Steak Sauber we've already talked about. I mean, they're
Yeah.
focused on 2026. We get it. They're going to be out there running around the back of the field. They know that next year Cadillac's going to be there and Cadillac will be at the back of the field. It's sort of like, okay, well, next year we may still finish 10th, but at least we won't be last, one of those deals. And so I didn't mean that to sound so cold, but it's probably the reality of it. But then
Yeah.
there's RB, and it's just sort of like, man, I don't know what happened to those guys. And it could be that they just got caught out by the crazy track conditions. It could be something that
Yeah.
simple.
I'm kind of hoping you're right on that
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
especially if we go back to last year, this time, everybody, you remember everyone was talking about how V Carb's car was the old RB19
Right.
and how close was it. And then they did really well during the season, and it was clear that that was not the case. So you have to wonder, is there something masking what happened? Because you do have Yuki, who, as we saw at the end of the year, was doing good. But then I
Hmm.
also have to wonder mental capacity. Is
Right.
is he bummed? And is it
Has
kind of
to
like,
be.
okay, yeah, right? It seems
Yep.
like he would have to be. And then
Yep.
Isaac, I'm concerned for Isaac because he also had some major emotional moments. And I thought, this is not what Laurent Macchi needs right now. Like he needs
Mm-mm.
two drivers
Too
who are going to pull out
super
every bit.
emotional.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm just, for two very different reasons, I'm cautious about both of these teams and what the year is going to look like for them. And they're going to be at the back end. Hopefully not, but it seems like unless something major changes on the RB side, I just don't see it. I don't think, if anything, it would lead me to the question I was going to ask is who do you think is the happiest and who do you think is the saddest? I would say who is the saddest is RB and Steak Sauber leaving
Yeah, and
Bahrain.
I would say it's RB because Steak
Yeah?
Sauber kind of walked in knowing what the deal was going to be.
That's a good
RB
point.
is walking out going, what just happened?
Yeah, that's probably very true. So then who would you say is the happiest?
Probably, I would throw call it a tie between probably say like maybe McLaren and maybe say Alpine. Because Alpine or maybe Williams, because Alpine and Williams definitely punched above their weight. I think Red Bull is still kind of like, okay, maybe we did okay, maybe we didn't. Maybe we just hit the chassis setup with these new development bits right when the weather suited us the most. Because right, they just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas McLaren, they were kind of there They were there or thereabouts most of the time. But then Alpine and Williams, oh, they look pretty good. Now, here's the deal. If Aston really was running with a turned down engine and they were the king of the sandbaggers this time, they may be laughing all the way home.
I think you're right. So here's what I would say. I feel like Alpine and Williams for sure have to be feeling really good. Williams, I think, is probably breathing some level of a protected sigh of relief. Like they're like,
Hmm.
okay, we got through that. That's not as bad. We, like quietly going, okay, that's just what I needed to get through the next 2 weeks for a very different set of reasons, like with all the discord and disorganization that they had and how they came overweight, paint, and all that kind of stuff last year. They're like, okay, we salvaged our reputation a little bit and let's see if we can keep this up. And like, please, nobody, like, I guess I think of a house of cards. Like, you're like, please, nobody hit the house of cards so it doesn't all come tumbling down. Because I don't
Right.
know that you could totally fix all the problems that seemed to be obvious last year within a couple of short months.
Yep.
But you can put bandages and kind of keep it stable and hope that it doesn't just fall on you. And then I do agree with you on the Aston. I feel like, though, McLaren based off of what you said about the Floviz, if we were there and kind of like had a fly on the wall, they're probably all in the back. If it is like as good as we hope that they're thinking it is, they're probably like quietly trying to high five and not let anybody know. And maybe that's
Yeah.
also Aston as well. Maybe both of them in their respective garages are like, yeah, and like, don't say a word, don't let it come out because then
Hmm.
everybody's gonna know. And so if that's the case, I'm like, I've already felt like 25 is going to be a great season. I feel like testing gave us enough to kind of feel good that our presumptions might actually be on track.
Oh yeah. As a Fernando fan, I would love to think that the Aston Martin is actually the equal of at least the Ferrari,
Yeah. Oh
because then
my
we get a
goodness.
Fernando and Lewis going at each other.
Oh man, wouldn't that be beautiful?
Would love to watch that. I'd be yelling at the
Oh, just
TV
yes.
every weekend.
Exactly. Oh, that'd be so great. I'm like grinning from ear to ear. I cannot wait for Australia. It's going to be, I mean, especially remember last year's Australia race with the
Yeah,
Red Bull losing power in the middle of the race. And then, of course, Carlos's appendectomy. It was
right,
just, and then the year before, we had the whole Crash Mageddon. So,
right.
I mean, Australia always seems to be a great race, and I'm
Yep,
excited that
I am
we
too.
only have a couple of weeks.
Yep.
So, I guess the last thing that we could just talk about really quickly is we've actually highlighted a lot of drivers, and we did mention one of the rookies. But let's just look at the rookie drivers because unlike last year, where the grid stayed stable when it came to drivers, this year we had a number of rookies coming in. So, what approach do you think teams are taking to help the rookies maximize the opportunity ahead of the season when they're walking into testing?
I think it's really interesting because I think it depends on the team. With Red Bull, obviously they're looking for Liam Lawson to be a great understudy to Max. Let Max do all the winning, but Liam, we need you to deliver points. And so this was all about getting him comfortable, I think, in that car and the environment that he's operating in. On the other hand, if you take a guy like Bortello, let's think about him. He's at stake. I mean, for
Oh, I feel so
him,
sorry for
dude,
him.
it's just be close to Hulkenberg. Eventually, if you can be quicker than Hulkenberg, great. Learn all the tracks that you've never raced at. Like he's never driven at Japan or
Hmm.
Singapore or China or Vegas, any of those places. So just go drive, learn the tracks, all that kind of stuff. And then in 2026, we'll see what you're really made of. So I think each rookie is in a different situation. So they're going to go, the teams, assuming that they're wise and, they're business people, they get it. It's develop that talent for the various circumstances that they're in. Kimi Antonelli, he's exactly in the same position that Liam Lawson is in, where he's got to deliver points. He's not expected to win necessarily, but he's got to deliver points. So they're going to help him do whatever it takes so that he maximizes what he's going to produce on race weekends. And obviously, there's a learning curve there and all that kind of stuff. But that's really what they were doing. And of course, developing the rookies, all of the rookies, help them develop their feedback, to become more valuable to the race engineers and that kind of stuff.
So, where do you think on that spectrum of points versus just get through the race and be as close to your teammate as possible? Where do you think Jack Doohan sits? And do you think he has a shorter timeline than everybody else because we know it's being discussed that Franco Colapinto is sitting in the wings?
Yeah, well, I mean, and Colapinto is signed with Alpine, right, as a reserve driver.
Hmm.
So Jack got pretty chippy with the press. By all accounts that I read, the team is saying that they thought he did a great job for his first preseason test, and they like the fact that he got chippy with the press. Right now, I don't think he's under any particular pressure, but that pressure is there for sure because they went and hired Colapinto, who we all know is bloody quick. Now, he's a bit of a car crasher, but he's quick. You really want these young guys to be fast and hairy to start out with and maybe crash every now and then, as opposed to be slow and consistent, because it's really a whole lot easier to get the fast, hairy guy to just kind of tone it down a little bit and, curb your enthusiasm. Whereas the slower guy, it's harder to make him fast.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think that their expectation for Jack is points?
I think the occasional point. I mean,
Hmm.
it's as the season goes, it's narrowing the gap between him
Hmm.
and Pierre.
Yeah. Well, because I'm thinking back to our conversation about where the car came in at testing compared to last year. Last
Hmm.
year, they had two veteran drivers basically that didn't get a car that really took advantage
Right,
of their skill. And here
right.
you've got a car that you have improved upon. You have a
Hmm.
veteran and you have a rookie,
Hmm.
and you have a rookie in the wings. How much
Hmm.
time do you give that rookie, and what are your expectations? I guess is what I'm trying to figure it out. I would imagine they don't want to give him too much time if they believe their car is a points gaining car. Don't you
Yeah.
think?
I mean,
Yeah.
if Gasly's out there scoring points all the time and Jack isn't, at some stage, you got to look at it and say, okay, have we given this kid enough of time to do what he needs to do and prove to us that he belongs? Or do we need to say, yeah, Jack, you're now the reserve driver and we're bringing in Franco?
It's kind of taking a page out of a Red Bull
Oh, yeah.
playbook. And it also makes me wonder regarding Jack, just how much pressure that puts on him. And if the pressure was intended because he was one of the drivers that you said is a little bit slower but consistent, and they want him to go further. And if
Right.
because if they've chosen a reserve driver who has the kind of opposing
Right.
style of attack. So
Yeah.
that's interesting to me.
And
Okay.
understand that's a very fine line because, Jack is very accomplished and he's
Oh, of
not
course.
by any stretch of the imagination slow. Um,
No.
right.
It's comparative to his peers, but
Yep.
if anything, I have been so impressed because he did a number of F1 commentaries like post and pre-race. I'm telling you,
Hmm.
that kid is so smart. And I
Yeah.
just loved listening to him. It helped me to understand the sport better. And I thought when they signed him, I thought it was such a wise decision. Of course, that was before a lot of the institutional culture changes that happened inside of Alpine. And I was like, I really wish they would be able to give him the full amount of time to
Hmm.
mature in there because he just seems like if given that opportunity, he's gonna bloom. And to have Pierre as his teammate, I feel like it's kind of the way that I think that Yuki improved by having Pierre as a teammate.
Yep.
I feel like Jack being paired up with Pierre is only going to make both of them better because they just seem to get it.
Yep.
Okay, well, that's looking at our wonderful rookies of the year. And I think that we have had a very thorough discussion of testing 2025. What do you think?
I think so.
Okay.
2 weeks away, we'll find out who's been sandbagging and who hasn't.
I'm so excited. I love Formula One.
I never would have guessed.
No, no. Okay. Well, I'm glad that I've kept it hidden until now
That's right.
and that I get to discuss these things with you and that we are able to do this podcast. We're really grateful. I want to say this before the season starts. You, me, John, we're all very grateful for our listeners who have helped us to build this podcast and that they want us to keep talking about all this stuff. We got
Absolutely.
feedback from one listener that we're apparently the thinking person's podcast. Did you see that note that we got?
I did not.
Apparently that's one of the feedback. So I took that as a high compliment
Heck
that
yeah.
we come across as thinking people because we're just having fun and
That's
trying to
right.
like dissect it. Maybe it's me overanalyzing it, you keeping me from going too far down the road. So yeah, but we're so grateful. I'm so grateful for your time, and I can't wait to see where 2025 leads us.
Yeah, this is fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, sabrina@2guysaGirlAndF1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.